recording. The
Well
Italian
done.
word is register. This is the 23rd Academia Bessarion meeting, and we always use the frescoes of the house of the Cardinal Bessarion in Rome, which I saw when I was very young, 21 years old, with my first baby in my arms, and I fell in love with the place. So I've called this the Academia Bessarion. And tonight, I'm in the throes of writing this book on Dante, very much influenced by Dennis Looney, who is with us. And so I'm sort of hoping that I have the chance to talk about it and to formulate its ideas a bit better. It is a bit of a muddle, and I don't know quite how to cope with it. But let's see if we can go to the next slide. Yes, here we have Dante. And last time I was talking about discoveries, and I had created the first chapter, Dante's Florence, which is actually an app where you can walk around the city of Florence and peel back the layers to find the buildings, the columns, the churches, and so forth that were there in Dante's time and which were part of his biography. And the title of the book, because it's going to have a sort of spin to it, is Di questa commedia letto ti giuro, a study of Dante and his circle. And it's a book which plays on layers of meanings of neuroscientific dream time, as well as phenomenological reality in time and space. It's a book based on primary materials, not secondary scholarship. And I'm going to get into trouble for that. But it's based on manuscripts and on buildings and so forth. And I see Dante's Commedia as a kind of confession manual, but with laughter. And he's playing tricks with us as he teaches us. And we have to think of it in terms of layers. The first layer is the real flesh and blood and bones, Dante, the author, in red, and it's true. It's the material cause, it's the literal level, it's outside the poem. And it's Florence until the exile, 1265, 1321. And then he creates of that material the fiction, the poem Easter 1300, which is actually the dates work out the 1301, where he's no longer the author in red, but he's the apprentice in blue. And it's a dream fiction. And it's the formal and efficient causes, Aristotelian causes. It's the moral and allegorical levels. It's playing with the mind and the soul instead of the flesh and the blood and the body. And it's within the poem. And then the third level is everywhere, 13.2 to 20.22. It's we, the reader, we, the freedom reader, if we want to use Dennis Looney's wonderful phrase for freedom rider. And it's true, and it's the efficient and final causes, it's the moral and anagogical levels, it's the soul, it's beyond the poem, it's what it teaches us, and as we interact with it, we become more intense and more real. So I've begun the book now with 2 sonnets and 2 stories, and then it goes on through the preface, which will give a talk I gave in Philadelphia on neuroscience and Dante, timeline, Dante's Florence, Dante's schooling. The 3 beasts are the 3 stages of Dante's life, the leopard, the lion, and the wolf, where he manages rather like St. Francis. And the next chapter is on his fraudulence, his thieving, his plagiarizing, his monster Geryon. The next one is on his doubleness and his laughter. And then there's a chapter on theatre and music. And then one on the geography he creates, his labyrinth becoming cosmos. And the final chapter, very much influenced by Dennis Looney, who visited here in this cemetery and taught me so much on decolonialism. And then I give in the appendices the Mare Amorosa, which I think Dante wrote as a young adolescent. and Brunetta's debate on death, and also Brunetta's Lauda, and a bibliography which is about 28 pages. I'm going to skip over this because it's going to get a bit boring. The two sonnets, one is the one that Guido Cavalcanti wrote for the miracles that took place in Or San Michele, and that was in 1292. It was documented in Villani as well as in Guido's sonnet, where he's writing it to, okay, somebody else is coming in, welcome. And he is debating with Guido Orlandi. Orlandi tells him, no, you can't have lay religion. You have to be obedient to the church hierarchy. But Guido says, no, he wants to prefer this civic lay religion. And then we also have the sonnet that Dante wrote to his teacher, presenting the Vita Nova to him 2 years later, 1293. Then I also wanted to begin the book with two power women topos. These are comic stories against women by scholars, misogynistic scholars. And one of them is the story of Aristotle, Alexander, and Phyllis. And here we see Aristotle as Arab, because this story has come by way of the Greek through the Arabic learning, Alfonso Savio, into the Christian Latin West. And sorry about that. And then his pupil, Alexander, the little prince, plays a trick on him and gets him to fall in love with Phyllis, who has golden hair and is dressed in red. And she persuades Aristotle to go on all fours and let her ride him. Meanwhile, Alexander is laughing from the top window. And this gets echoed when Dante meets his teacher in the Inferno and Canto 15, where his teacher is below him and stark naked, instead of up above him in the cathedra in red and ermine. And how many of us teaching have had these awful nightmares about showing up to lecture to our students and we have no clothes on and we haven't prepared the lecture? I'm sure we've all had that dream. And then the next one is the joke about Virgil, who is tricked by a woman into suspending him in a basket halfway up and halfway down this tower, which is called Virgil's Tower, which in the Middle Ages was next to Titus's arch. And the Arch of Titus has the spoils of the Jerusalem temple on it. Here you see Titus in his chariot. I'm always doing this problem. And here you see the 7-branch candlestick and so forth. Okay, right. I hope we can manage this. When Brunetto went to Alfonso Savio's court in 1260 to get help, he found himself needing to acquire books of this new learning from the Greco-Arabic world, which was available at Alfonso's court, as it also was at Frederico's court. And I'm not sure why I'm having difficulty with the audio. Can you all hear me? I hope you can all hear me. Yes. This manuscript is the Libro della Scala, the Kitab al-Mirag, which was translated at Alfonso's court by the Al-Fakim Abraham, who was Jewish, and Bonaventure da Siena into Latin. It was translated into French, Anglo-Norman French, and it's in the Bodleian Library. But that illustration is by a Uyghur manuscript later. And then we have Brunetto teaching in his cathedra to Dante and to Francesco da Barberino in a manuscript that Francesco da Barberino writes out. These are the manuscripts that I believe are in Dante's hand, and Also, we have this very interesting, he plays games with the Bestiaire d'Amour, where the author says, the text has both an eye and an ear. You read it aloud and you also see it. It's a synesthesia, which was typical of medieval manuscript performance, being read aloud as well as being seen, which is an aspect we've lost. And then this is the manuscript, which I think is by Dante's own handwriting when he's adolescent. And it's the Tesoretto and the Mare Amoroso. The Mare Amoroso ends with this love declaration by Antinous to Hadrian, which, if it's Dante's writing, puts a spin onto the Canto 15. I believe that Dante is himself the sinner in each of those sins. And this is where he's talking about himself as having this tendency as a rather confused adolescent, rather than his master. And then more of the manuscripts, I believe he writes. And then we performed all of the music he mentions in the Commedia, the 2-hour concert that we performed in Graz, Cologne, Avila, Ravenna, and the Duomo, and San Michele. It was a wonderful experience. The music is wonderful. And we found in the process 7 motets where Dante juxtaposes secular, profane music with sacred music, as this was a kind of medieval game that was played musically. And I'm hoping everyone can still hear me, because I'm getting the message that the sound isn't very good.
I hear you.
Good. Okay, I'll carry on not being worried. Thank you. Francesco de Barberino's later illustrations to the Tesoretto evoke the celebration to the god of love by the Fedeli d'Amore in Piazza Santa Felicita, 24th of June, 1283, which is 700 years ago. And this is the Dolce Stil Novo school of poets, deriving from the Sicilian, the Provençal, the Franciscan, and the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which Alfonso El Savio had given to Brunetto during his embassy. And it's absolutely fascinating because they say that during this period in the Middle Ages, you did not have freestanding statues on pillars, because that was known to be what pagan idols had, statues of emperors, statues of gods that you had to make sacrifices to. And in fact, in this square in Florence, the church is dedicated to St. Perpetua. And she is, no, Santa Felicita, excuse me. St. Felicity is the first martyr mentioned in the canon of the Mass. And she is an African slave who is pregnant, who is killed in the arena because she refuses to sacrifice to idols on pillars. And so also is her mistress. She dies after her, Perpetua, who is pregnant. No, she's had her baby and she's still lactating. It's an incredible story. It's set in Carthage in Africa, and I'm going to be bringing in Africa a lot in this talk. And what's interesting here is that Francesco de Barberino draws the column with the Corinthian capital with the naked god of love on top, shooting arrows at both their directions. And here we still have the column bound in iron with the Corinthian capital in that piazza, which Villani says on that day 1,000 young Florentines came, all dressed in white. And Dante was 18 years old, and he says in the Vita Nova that when he was 18, he saw Beatrice in white. So I suspect he's talking about this. So what I'm sort of saying is that all of this adolescent sexuality, Alice Walker, God stuff, lovers, lunatics, and poets, is the game that they're playing. And this is Francesco de Barberino's illustration in the Tesoretto and in the Documenti d'Amore. which shows up also in the Palatino Canzoniere, where you get this rather strange Arabic-looking god of love with wings, who is defecating. But they show the various poets of the Fedeli d'Amore. This is Piero della Vigna smashing his head against the prison wall of the tower in Borgo San Lorenzo, which I climbed after they rebuilt it after the Second World War's bombing. Now, I want to come to this because we have in our audience tonight 3 members of the Heckscher family whom I just love. Charlotte and my son Colin were great friends at Princeton. William Sebastian Heckscher was this marvelous art historian. I used to sort of have conversations with him around the book catalogues in the Princeton University Library. He was a friend of Einstein and Janssen and so forth. And he came to my class and gave this wonderful talk on the Spinario. This is the little bronze statue that was then on top of a column outside the Pope's palace in the Lateran. And next to it was another column on top of which was a cock to crow to warn him to not betray the church, because the medieval Catholicism was quite capable of criticizing itself. The little boy for the Middle Ages represented amore, Cupid, the sexuality, the cupidity, which caused the fall of mankind, who now has to walk amongst the thistles and thorns of the earth. The little boy is pulling the thorn out of his foot. Now it was by the Pope Piccolomini Aeneas put instead in the Capitoline. It's in the museum instead of as a object to throw stones at. But what's interesting here is that we remember in Virgil's story that when Aeneas arrived in Carthage and Dido was the widowed queen, Venus, who is Aeneas's mother, tricks Dido by putting not Ascanius, Aeneas's little boy, but her own son, Cupid, Amore, in Dido's lap. And this causes Dido to fall tragically in love with Aeneas, which will end in her suicide. Brunetto was teaching his students from Ovid the art and the remedy of love, how to fall in love and also how to fall out of love again without too much damage being done. And this is a wonderful medieval Ovid with his beautiful screw desk, which was absolutely right, because you really should read books at an angle to the eye, not straight the way modern architects make us do it. And this is also the story of Paola and Francesca, which got read in the 19th century very romantically, Emma Bovary, Anna Karenina, and so forth. But for Dante, really was a double-edged text. He says that the book was a Galeotto, and he who wrote it, who is Dante, who's writing it, who is writing pornography, who's causing the love affair to start between Francesca and Paolo as they domino and mirror that of Lancelot and Guinevere, which will cause the loss of Camelot, which with Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve will stain the earth with blood, as a result of which Dante, falling for his own pornography, falls as a dead body falls, come corpo morto cade. But what is interesting is that there's this enormous shift that takes place in Florence from Piazza San Felicita with the column to the god Amore, which is a very precocious beginning of Florentine freestanding statues like Donatello's Bacchus and Michelangelo's David, which are really idols and so forth, to now being O San Michele, where they revere the image of the Virgin in a tabernacle, so she's not freestanding. And this is Guido's sonnet about the miracles that this image caused in 1292. So we've gone from 1283 to 1292. And Cavalcanti's house was right by Or San Michele. And there's this story about how he walked up here, Calzaiolo, to the Duomo, and he was there where all of these tombs for the members of the Compagnia dell'Ardesi di Or San Michele. Florence, I mean, I was told when I first came to Florence, the thing you have to do if you want to become Florentine, you've got to join groups. And Florence is made up of groups that carry out the 7 acts of mercy, the Misericordia, and so forth. And also was the Compagnia dell'Ardesi, lay people coming together to singing lauda, Franciscan lauda, in the vernacular. And the music and the words are fabulous. And here we've got Guido leapfrogging over the tombs, and he's going to be buried in one of them. When the Blackwells show up, Corso Donati's group, who are against him, and they're taunting him for not being Orthodox Christian. And this was the sculpture which gets repeated in Purgatorio 10 of the Annunciation, which marked where the tombs were below it, on beside Santa Reparata, before Santa Maria del Fiore has been built. And we also have even the necrology, which shows the names of people like Brunetto Latini, Filippo Agenti, Guido Cavalcanti, and many women, because it was equal for women and for men. And then this is Or San Michele, which is imitating the Alfonsine Las Cantigas de Santa Maria with the miracles of the Virgin. They've now transposed these to Florence. I took this photograph years ago before they cleaned it up, when you could still light candles, which I used to light for my children. And here again, you see the Cantigas, you see the Madonna. And this is the entry for Guido Cavalcanti's burial. Doesn't give in this case, it does give the year 1300. He died of fever, coming back from exile, which Dante had imposed on him and on Corso Donati, because they were fighting against each other. And we find that this whole circle of Dante, Monna Bianca, Brunetto's daughter, wills a large portion of her wealth to the Compagnia dell'Ardesi. Dante Alighieri's daughter Antonia, now named Beatrice, a nun at San Stefano degli Ulivi in Ravenna, is given 10 gold florins by Boccaccio from the Compagnia dell'Ardesi di Or San Michele. I read this in his Baldoni, written in his own hand. And then Monna Bianca dies and gives her wealth. Pietro Alighieri wills the Dante house to the Compagnia dell'Ardesi di Or San Michele. And then finally, even we find them selling a manuscript of the Roman della Rose, and so forth. The Vita Nova. Remember that Dante is encouraged to be in love with this 8-year-old girl. She's the daughter of a leading banker. She's a bit like Daisy with money in her voice. It's not going to be possible for him to marry her. And her father has founded Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. I ended up here this past month with my heart doing problems, and still working. Here you see the tent for the COVID, and so forth. And then we have this wonderful identification by Dante Gabriel Rossetti with Dante in his series of paintings of the Vita Nova. But his God of love is not a naked boy. He's clothed. It's being rather Victorian, but this is a very lush Victorian scene of Beatrice's dying. And then this is Dante painting angels a year after Beatrice's death, and Beatrice's brother coming to him, and so forth. And this is a sonnet that Brunetto was given by Dante, who speaks of it as the Eucharist, as something to be eaten, not that she reckons feasting, whose need is to be fed, but read. And this copies from Brunetto's own Lauda to the Virgin Mary, where he also talks about the Paschal feast and so on. And here I wanted to talk, this is something I'm still trying to figure out for the book, Janus Gates. He Dante uses the image of Master Janus. Janus was the arch for the two faces for the old and the new year. But also triumphal arches are not really practical. They are built into city walls. They're freestanding. And you went with your chariot to celebrate your great victory and all the bloodshed you had caused. And you dragged through it your slaves who would then be killed. And so it meant both triumph and disaster. And so what I'm seeing, the text is a kind of through the looking glass text, a doubleness. Dante speaks of the pulcherrime ambeges. And these are the two stemma of the city of Florence we have on our wall here in this English cemetery, but which used to be on the Porta Pinti gate, through which Corso Donati entered Florence to create mayhem when he became a kind of Trump dictator of the city, causing Dante's exile. But we earlier talked about how the rose windows, this is an idea that goes back to John Lyely and Donald Howard. Donald Howard took it from John Lyely. The outside of a rose window is black and grey and not beautiful. And then when you go in, it's completely transformed, the perspective. This is very much based on the Boethian concept of the circle in the center and so forth. And also coins have the obverse and the reverse. This is the Florentine florin with the lily and St. John the Baptist. But this doubleness of perspective. Here we've got the Stinche, which was built in Dante's time, and it only had one small door to this very large prison. So if you could be ransomed and you could be freed and back into freedom instead of being incarcerated. I actually did lecture on Dante in Attica State Prison. So you've got this polarity between nightmares and good dreams. And I'm going to, when we come to the very end of the talk, perhaps show you Giambattista Piranesi's engravings for the Carceri. But this is also for the children's book, Where the Wild Things Are, where Max in his wolf suit dreams up all of these animals. Remember that when we were children, those monsters were very real, and the adults couldn't understand us when we were insisting they were. They were saying they were nonsense. But neuroscientifically, the right hemisphere does hallucinate and loses that aspect as it becomes more literate. I love this piazza in Rome. This was designed by Piranesi. It's for the Knights of Malta. And you can go to the keyhole, and through it, you can see all of St. Peter's. Somebody has a magnifying glass. That looks wonderful. And then the Piranesi, where you get the dystopia and the utopia. And also the St. Francis used to go up in the Assisi to the Carceri for his contemplation. It was his place of renewal and so forth. Dante says in the Convivio that after Beatrice's death, he is reading Boethius and Cicero's Somnium Scipionis. And the Somnium Scipionis is where Scipio Africanus, his younger Scipio, his father had razed Carthage and plowed it under with salt. But he's in Africa and he dreams of his ancestors. And he looks back down on the earth and it is so small. It's to them, they thought it was ugly, but we know from the Apollo how beautiful it is. And then we also have the Kitab al-Mirag, the Libro della Scala, written by the, translated by the Al-Fakim Abraham and Bonaventure of Siena. And here we see the Scala. And this has the monster of Geryon, but she is with a woman's face instead of a man, and also benevolent instead of malevolent, with the angel Gabriel here leading the journey, and Muhammad, who has this dream at Jerusalem. And Also, it includes so much that gets into Dante's poem, for instance, the serpents and so on. I do believe that they are connected. And let's see. Okay, let's see if we can go. This is fascinating. Sandor Burke, he has written a graphic novel, and Beatrice is a Latina who's selling tacos. And there's a wonderful scene where Statius is bowing to Virgil, but he's dressed in a business suit and is taking place in the Tokyo railroad station. And here it's looking down on the Kaaba as the white rose. It's a very multicultural version of Dante. It's brilliantly done. And Christina Olsen has written a wonderful review of it, and I couldn't resist putting it in. But also Dante got these ideas not only from the Kitab Mirag, but also from Irish material. I was very blessed when I came to Florence. First, I was outside of Florence, living in one unheated room amongst the contadini, in the part that had been very much influenced by Irish pilgrims, and they knew the stories. And San Donato had showed up in the 9th century, got elected as a pilgrim from Ireland, got elected as bishop, wrote a wonderful poem about St. Bridget of Ireland, where she hangs her cloak on a sunbeam to dry when it gets wet. And that's this manuscript, which I read in the Laurentian Library. And also here we get this wonderful Scottish painting of St. Bridget being taken in her sleeve. Also the ship voyage, a beautiful gold ship, which is in the Dublin Museum. These stories of St. Patrick's Purgatory, the voyage of Bran and the voyage of St. Brendan, were known in that part, and the children and the whole families went to that part to stay during the summers when it got too hot. So Dante did have access in the oral way to these stories. And then this final chapter, which is very much influenced by Dennis Looney, on freedom readers. And I love this map that showed up on Facebook today, because it's the Mediterranean at the other angle. And you can see how close Africa is to Europe, how intertwined we are. And then this is the drawing that, that we had in the Tesoretto by Francesco de Barberina of the Mediterranean upside down. It's the same here. The Pillars of Hercules are drawn here. And he's contemporary with Dante, fellow scholar with Dante of Brunetta. So here we also have this illustration. And then I have this final part where I talk about against campanilismo, against nationalism, talking about Terence, which Pietro Alighieri says his father named the comedy after Terence's comedies. Terence was the ex-slave, African slave, creating these wonderful comedies in which the women and slaves come out on top, which were adopted throughout Europe by convents, by monks, to learn Latin, the purest Latin. It's Terence who comes up with the word huma, our humanitas, which we use for our humanities. And then I give the talk I gave at Attica State Prison, and I mentioned for classism how Beatrice smiles when the Lady of Malahold coughs when Dante starts boasting too much about his aristocratic background. No, the rose is equal, women and men. There's no class, social class, no hierarchy. Everything is, including pagans, the Brahmin on the Ganges, Ripheus, Trajan, and so forth. So I was talking about that and how this musically, when Dante meets with Beatrice, you get 4 motets at once. Psalms and passages about the Queen of Sheba and passages from Virgil and so on. They're brilliantly done. and tying that into the way in which at that point Virgil is gone and Beatrice has to console Dante for his loss. But he isn't really gone, because when you get to the celestial rose, it's being pollinated by the bees, which are straight out of Virgil's Aeneid. And here we see them. He says, "Conosco I segni dell'antica fiamma," which is what Dido said when the baby was placed in her lap. And then these are the similes about the bees. And then that is Dante's version of it. And what I loved when I was in Berkeley and Oakland during civil rights and registering Blacks for the first time to vote, we both would walk out of the room taller than we came in. On the buses were posters that quoted from the Song of Solomon: "Black is beautiful. She is black but beautiful." And I'm just hoping that American can get back more to that. And then we have this image of God with the compasses. Here I scanned this one and it comes out all dull. I tried to take a photograph of this one to show the gold leaf. Remember that medieval manuscripts with the gold leaf with candles, they moved. They seemed to move because the candles would not be static the way electric light is. And then Dante has the image of squaring the circle. And he does it several times in the Convivio, in the Commedia, and I believe he does it here when he's writing out Brunetto on the squaring of the circle. But also it's like the baptistry, the octagonal, where he was baptized. And these manuscripts, which I've discovered of the Tesoro, which are written by Dante, Brunetto's students in the 1280s, the 1290s, they include the squaring of the circle, but also the hierarchies of angels, which change the hierarchies to present Homer within that hierarchy, turning it into an equality, not a difference. So I'm giving you some of the texts on the squaring of the circle. And these also he uses the dropping of the stone, which gets stuck at the center, the way Satan does from Gossuin de Metz, Image du Monde. And Dante is very, he says he's not sure if it's Gregory or Dionysius, and he gives it quite differently from either of them. But this is the drawing in the manuscript that I think is by Dante, where you have Homer amongst the hierarchy of the angels. So that is the structuring of the book. I hope it's going to make sense. I'm playing games with it. I'm putting quite a bit of my own autobiography into it, since Dante says you're not meant to, but he does. So I'm doing it. And so there we go to that. And we can now interrupt the condivisione. And right, who do we have? Thank you, Charlotte. It's lovely seeing you. Philip from Iceland, Dennis. And, did it make sense? Dennis, you're the one who can most criticize this. Everyone,
yes,
yes.
Does it make sense? I mean, that's a lot of those many images. The images are wonderful, and to and much of that I don't know much about at all. So I'm, dazzled by my own ignorance and what there is to learn, especially about Dante and Brunetto and those things. But you're tracing it in a way that makes it sensible or understandable. And so, I don't know if does it make sense is the right question, but it makes sense and one can follow, although there's a lot of stuff. I do have I have one big question and one small question, but
Yes.
maybe the small question is a bigger question. When Dante says about Gerion, reader, I swear to you, this is what I really saw. I swear on the notes of my comedy. I think we, meaning philologists, are certain that he says Comedia. This sounds like a pedantic point, but he doesn't say commedia, he says comedia, and that's the way he said it. And I assume that there is textual, philological, primary text support of that. And I think that I have Durlin and Martinez Purgatory here. I don't have the Inferno right in front of me, but everybody now is spelling that word with one M. I don't know I mean, that doesn't, the content matters more perhaps than the shape of the word. But if you're going to make a case for the value of primary texts, and you think a text that Dante wrote use a word in the way that he spelt it, commedia, that's a tiny thing, but maybe it's a bigger thing. But here's a question that also came to mind as you were talking about campanalismo and regionalism, nationalism, and partisanship and all of that. Why someone would immediately ask you, why does Dante then write in Florentine, in his version of this local language, rather than in the international language,
Right.
which he started
Yes.
in, and which he did. He did a fair number of. He did a bit on, and other people encouraged him to continue in that international mode, and he didn't. And because he didn't, his language becomes his very local language, which, as you know, is full of all kinds of localisms, not just Tuscan, but also these other places where he was. It becomes, the standard for the Italian language, but language ought to be a part of that conversation too. And so my question could be, just to simplify it,
Right.
why
Right.
Italian and not Latin?
Yes. Well, what he says in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, etc., and also in Convivio and so on, is that his language, Italian, is the language of women and children. They are excluded from Latin. And he says that Latin is static, and that when they did try to learn Latin, they had to do it through Italian. And Brunetto always saw to it that he was translating Cicero and Aristotle into Italian. And he did make the right choice, because here we are, English speaking, working with an Italian text, and we love it for that. And it would have turned us off if it were in Latin. It would have excluded us, and this does not. And he talks about how a modern language is constantly changing, but he is also humble. He doesn't accept Florentine, Tuscan language. He accepts as the best language the Bolognian language, and he says that. Because he's trying to get away from being, people think of him as so proud, the statue in Santa Croce, but he's actually showing that only when he is sinning is he proud. And then he learns how to be humble. And at the end, he's not telling you, but he composed Vergine Madre Figlia del tuo Figlio. That's nowhere in St. Bernard's writings. He's kind of muffled himself, and he has learned to be humble in the text. And
well, that's a very good response. That is the Italian over Latin, and we could talk about his kind of Italian, is a way of universalizing it. One could say Latin was the international language, but as you point out, it
has to be
excludes
living,
a whole class of people. And so that's a good response. Thank you.
Okay, and that's what we've called our project, Dante Vivo, where we've performed the music, we put the text with the images, the readings, and so forth, trying to get back to the right hemisphere way in which medieval texts were read. Aesthetically, they were so intense. And we, with the Renaissance chiaroscuro, that sort of went out the window, and then even more so with Enlightenment, where we just read silently, black and white pages and so on. And that's not the experience of a medieval text, which would have been read to Moroello, Malaspina, Can Grande della Scala, and so forth. They were performed. And I feel that actually, if we can go back to our young people and encourage them to do that with the web, we've now got all of the technology where we can go back to the gold leaf and the movies and the sounds and so on and so forth, which we couldn't with the cheapness of the printing press. I think we're on the verge of a new world, and I think it'll be a world that will open up Dante a lot more than the way he's become rather stuffily taught. And that's why I so loved your book, Freedom Reader. And Dante plays all kinds of rhetorical games where he's trying to teach us not to fall for false rhetoric. You were not born to live as beasts, and so on and so forth. That's straight out of Catiline's suicide speech at Fiesole. It's not something to fall for, but everyone does. And this was already being taught in the art of the Arte Onesti Amandi of the Andreas Capellanus to Walter. He was teaching it tongue-in-cheek, the way Ovid was. But poor C.S. Lewis in The Allegory of Love misread it on one level only, didn't read the doubleness. And he got it right by the discarded image, but it meant that the Allegory of Love caused real problems in the scholarship for a while. I'm talking too much. Phil, can you say something?
Julia?
Yes.
Julia?
Yes, Sue.
It's Sue, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, when Dennis's comment made me think of something with the Spanish language, with the use of the familiar, the tú versus, I don't even know my Spanish, and I'm half Spanish, but unfortunately, I was thinking when Dante said, me comedia, he was doing it in a diminutive sense, like this is my baby in some way. I don't know. When you said women and children,
Right.
I don't know if that makes any sense. It was just a thought.
Yes, Sue, I lip read, so
educated
I'm
thought.
not being able to catch everything you're saying.
I'm sorry.
But he did have access to Spanish, Castilian, Catalan, Gallegos, which is what the language, almost Portuguese, that Dante is using, that Alfonso is using for Las Cantigas, because it was the poetic language in Spain. And he's talking a great deal about all of these dialects, and he gives wonderful examples. Phil, you would love De Vulgare Eloquentia. Phil is the great translator of Icelandic novels. And he was my student at Bode, who now lives on Iceland, for a while was teaching in China, and I'm really proud of him, and so forth. And Charlotte, do you have, Phil, do you have any comments?
Actually, I think I had never heard of the Kitab el Miraj before, and I'm just fascinated by it.
It's a wonderful text.
Which I was like really surprised about that. So I don't understand why I've never come across that connection, or that it suggested this major influence upon Dante through that book. So
there was a fearsome row when the book was first published by the Vatican on the influence of the Kitab on Dante. And the Italian Dante scholars really wanted to reject that. But it is now becoming more and more accepted. And it does fit, because the same kinds of sins, the same kind of punishments, except that Dante puts a spin on that monster carrying Muhammad, who is benevolent and then becomes malevolent as Geryon in the Inferno. But remember that Dante specifically says that he's ornamented like a Muslim carpet. He is drawing attention to his Islamic aspect. And Charlotte, you have come from a family that is, could you add to this? Have you ever heard of this? Yes.
Julia, it is so wonderful to be in your presence. You are just so marvelous.
It's your father.
Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting. It's wonderful how you've brought everything together, and I feel William watching. And of course, my sisters are here. There's,
Yes.
I guess all of our screens look different, but there's Diana, and Kathy.
Yes. Right. No, I'm very pleased that we are all together.
Oh, Diana,
Ah,
look.
yes, the spinario, the spinario. There was this terrible moment when poor Sebastian Heckscher was giving this talk to my students, and the slide jumped out of my carousel, and we never were able to find it. And it was the one where you could see the genitalia, and he and I were both crying over the loss of the slide because he didn't figure out how we were going to make another one like it. This was up in, in Princeton University when we were doing this. But that was what was amazing at Princeton, was the people you would meet and talk with, especially from the Institute, like Julian Janes, who was talking about how Einstein's brain was in a jar in somebody's garage, and so on and so forth. But it was just an amazing time, and I so appreciated the chance to talk about books that we were writing, and he never did finish the book on the emblems, did he? And I would love to be with him to talk about how I'm seeing that Francesca de Barberino, who is Dante's co-student, is playing all kinds of emblem games before emblems really took off. The crazy Ouroboros figure and so forth. He has in the Documenti d'Amore. And I would have so loved to have shared that one with him.
Aw.
More comments, please. Or shall I show you the Piranesi? Because the Piranesi, if we can get it, is, let's see, is quite something. I hope this will work. And if it doesn't, we'll just, okay, let's see, we can condividi. I used to have nightmares as a child from being in taken to where there was a war armaments thing. I'm not sure if I can get the, okay, it's hard to move these. Okay, let's see if I can, right, now it's beginning. Somebody has made this aspect of it. Piranesi was an extraordinary architect and designer, and was absolutely brilliant at this. I first read about this when I was in school reading De Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater, where he's describing Coleridge, showing him these engravings, which I hadn't yet seen. But they reminded me that description of this nightmare I'd had, which is like Dante's hell. And Coleridge describes how you keep seeing Piranesi himself as a kind of lay figure within the images, and that he is lost, he is imprisoned, and so forth. And I finally saw one in the shop in Berkeley and bought the engraving and put it up above my bed. And it was so terrifying, I immediately took it down. But I mentioned this in the book about how we create these imaginary worlds and articulate them, which Dante does. And this is what I was hoping to be able to play with, those levels of what is real, what is imagined or memoried, and then the effect it can have on us. And I would love you to explore this yourselves on the web, because I think it is. I used to imagine what it would be like to produce Hamlet, for instance, in front of these engravings on scrims in a theatre. because they are extraordinary. And I loved once when I was here in Florence and someone had photographs by Hiram Power's son of the tombs in the cemetery, and she was showing them to me. And when I went into her house, she had the original Piranesi prints there. I was just dumbfounded by that. So I think now I can close that, but they are extraordinary. I think they'd be useful to use in teaching.
Yeah, that's amazing. I agree. That's really very captivating. And you're right. The
Remember,
internet,
I'm deaf.
I was just going to say the
Yeah.
internet
Mhm.
or multimedia
Wish I
now
could turn the
offers
music
all
off.
of
Okay.
these